Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video we're going to talk about the short-run Phillips curve. But before I do that, I want to really hone in on this idea of stabilization policy. So, stabilization policy is policies designed to correct recessionary and inflationary gaps. So we talked about that the economy can be in one of three places at any given point in time. You can either be in a recessionary gap, where the economy is sluggish, high unemployment, or in an inflationary gap or a positive output gap where there's high inflation, low unemployment. And that's the rub, because when we're trying to fix these gaps using stabilization policy, and we'll talk more about specific tools the government can use to stabilize the economy, stabilize the business cycle later on. But the problem is it often involves choosing between either higher inflation or higher unemployment in the short run. Because really what you're trying to do with stabilization policy is change aggregate demand. And when you shift aggregate demand either left or right, you're either going to get higher unemployment or higher inflation. And that's a problem, right? Because you're using aggregate demand to fix one problem and simultaneously creating another. And so that's kind of the rub, is how do you decide between those? And so it does make that challenging. One way to model this challenge of having to trade off between higher inflation and higher unemployment is something called the Phillips curve. So the Phillips curve is a model, a graph, that shows the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And there are two Phillips curve models. There's one for the short run and one for the long run, and yes, they look different. I will say, as an aside for the AP exam, the Phillips curve has increasingly in recent years been on the AP exam in a lot of different places, both in the multiple choice and in the free response. So it's definitely a model we need to understand. It's not like the business cycle where you just have to be able to recognize it. This you got to know inside and out. So with that in mind, let's talk about the short-run Phillips curve, which is a model that shows that trade-off, but in the short run between inflation and unemployment. Now, I have two graphs here, and that may freak you out. Oh my gosh, we've got another side-by-side thing. No. We're only going to put the short-run Phillips curve on one of these graphs. On the other one, we're going to put aggregate supply and demand, because part of what influences the Phillips curve in the short run and in the long run is what happens in the ADAS model. So over here, I'm going to go ahead and put the price level and Y, and we're going to go ahead and draw our ADAS model, so SRAS, and we'll go ahead and put it in long run equilibrium just like that with YF down here. And if we want, we can go ahead and do sorry, it's not making those dots for whatever reason. Sorry about that. Okay. And then PLF over here. It doesn't like me doing dots in this picture. But that'll have to do. There we go. Good enough. So PLF, YF, there's our ADS model. On the other side, let's go ahead and draw the Phillips curve. And so what are the labels going to be on the Phillips curve? Well, remember, it shows the trade-off between unemployment and inflation. So the labels are going to be on the Y-axis, we're going to put unemployment rate, and on the y-axis we're going to put the inflation rate. Students often ask me, like, can we abbreviate these? These are really hard to abbreviate. I would not use I and U, because those are like the I can mean investment or interest rate, and U usually means unemployment, but I would just go ahead and write them out every time just to be safe. Okay, we've been able to abbreviate a lot in this course. I think writing these two out isn't an issue. Now, in the short run, there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, and so the SRPC, the short-run Phillips curve, is going to be downward sloping. Okay, if you're wondering how the Phillips curve gets its name, it's from an Australian economist. I think he's Australian, or he might have been from New Zealand, one of those two countries, and he came up with the idea of the Phillips curve. So just so you know, the more you know. So now we've got our Phillips curve. It's downward sloping, and so you can see there is this trade-off. If I have higher inflation, that means lower unemployment. Lower inflation means higher unemployment. So, if I want to have less of one, I have to take on more of the other. And that's what makes stabilization policy so problematic. So let me show you what I mean here. So let's say we're in the long run model here, and let's say we've got some politicians who are making decisions, and their voters like, man, we need some more money in our pockets, right? Some stimulus checks maybe, since that's recently been in the news. And so we're going to stimulate the economy, and we're going to increase aggregate demand. So let's say that happens and aggregate demand moves to the right out of long run equilibrium. Okay, so AD to the right. Now, if I asked you, hey, what happens to unemployment? You would say, well, unemployment is going, and I'm abbreviating here, so don't do that, but unemployment is going to decrease, right? Because aggregate demand increases, there's more GDP, more stuff is being bought, and so you need more workers, so unemployment falls. But inflation, I'm going to abbreviate again here, don't do this, but I'm doing it, is going to increase. We have a higher price level, and so more inflation. So you see this trade-off. But how could we show that trade-off on the Phillips curve? Well, what would happen is we would move from, let's say, a point down here to a point up here along the Phillips curve. So we're moving from, say point A to point B. So a change in aggregate demand moves us along the Phillips curve because we're going from, let's give these some numbers. And again, I'm sorry about the dots. They're just not cooperating. So let's say we go from, 7% unemployment, although that's a little high for us being at the natural rate. So maybe this is more like 6% to, maybe we go to, okay, it likes the dashes, so we'll do the dashes. So maybe 3% unemployment, but we've got this, a higher inflation. So maybe we went from, 2% inflation. Now we've got 4% inflation, right? So we're trading off higher inflation in order to reduce unemployment. So you see that trade-off in action there. So if you're someone who's like, oh, Mr. Schmidt, just give me a rule, the rule would be that if you shift aggregate demand, that's going to be a movement along the Phillips curve. Again, for the AP exams, if you understand the why, you're going to be much more likely to be successful than if you just memorize a bunch of rules. So that's what happens if aggregate demand changes. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and clear all of this out. So this is going to take me just a second here. I'm going to keep the Phillips curve where it is. And then what I'm going to do, hopefully this works with the eraser. There we go. I'm going to get rid of the aggregate demand. You know what? We'll just redraw aggregate demand here. That's fine. The aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph here. So it's going to look a little different, but that's okay. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and redraw this in long run equilibrium really quickly here. So it's going to look a little sloppy, but that's okay. We've seen enough of these by now. We know how this works. So YF and PLF. Okay, so there's our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model again. And this time what we're going to do, let's play around with this. Let's say, okay, what happens if there is a change in short run aggregate supply? How would that impact the short run Phillips curve? So let's say we move short run aggregate supply to the right. Let's say there's lower input costs, okay? So when that happens, I'm going to go ahead and change my unemployment inflation markers down here. When SRAS shifts to the right, GDP increases. And so that means unemployment has to fall because they're opposites. We have more people, we have more stuff being produced. We need more workers to make the stuff. And because the price level has fallen, inflation is also decreased. So this is really interesting, right? We see that both of them have increased. So when we're moving short on aggregate supply, they both change in the same direction. So how would I show that on the short run Phillips curve? And the answer is it's going to be a curve shift. I'm actually going to shift SRPC to the left because when I do, this means less inflation and less unemployment at every single point along the short run Phillips curve. So the kind of rule here would be that if SRAS moves to the right, SRPC moves left. It moves in opposite directions because that's the only way you can show unemployment and inflation both decreasing, is you got to move the curve to the left. You can't move along the curve because if you do, one's going to go up and one's going to go down. So that's just another way to think about it. So to summarize, I have one final little slide here. So this is a really good kind of like nitty-gritty whatnot. I want to start down here with these two terms really quickly to wrap up this video. When I talk about the unemployment rate and the inflation rate on the SRPC graph, like whatever, if I pick a point and I say, okay, we're at this percent, 2% unemployment, 3% inflation. Those are the actual unemployment and inflation rates where we currently are. Remember that, because when we go to the long run Phillips curve, we're going to have different names for those two percentages. So just keep that in mind. These are the actual unemployment rate and the actual inflation rate. So then the other thing I put up here is you should move along the SRPC if inflation or unemployment changes. And typically the way you get that is if aggregate demand changes. You shift the SRPC left if unemployment and inflation decrease. And again, that's usually because SRAS has shifted to the right. And then you would shift the SRPC right if SRAS shifts left. So R and L. And that's how you would get unemployment and inflation increasing. The hard part, I think, about macro, to put a pin in this conversation, is understanding that these graphs work together, right? The PPC, ADAS, the Phillips curve, the business cycle. We're going to add some more before the course is over. You need to understand the relationships between these graphs. And we've had practice with this, whether it was perfect competition or labor markets. We've seen interactions between graphs before, and we need to keep working on those skills. So I encourage you to practice drawing these graphs and playing around with those interactions. So that's all for this video on the short run Phillips curve. Until next time, have a great day.